You'd need a water diviner to arrive at the exact Labour Party position on Brexit today. In the wake of their conference in Liverpool, about which they all seem tremendously pleased, we have a Labour frontbench with three drastically different positions on Brexit. We have the two most important, one assumes, Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, saying they don't rule out the so-called people's vote, but they rule out it being able to decide to cancel Brexit and remain in the EU. On the other hand, we have Keir Starmer, or Sir Keir, to give him his Sunday name, the name he inexplicably doesn't like to be called. He, in an unscripted departure from his agreed speech in Liverpool, pointedly put back on the table a referendum, again, which could decide to cancel Brexit altogether. The shadow Foreign Secretary, Emily Thornberry, had yet again a different position. She said we should go for the EEA option, which is effectively the Norway option. Now, apart from the practical, that such a multi-option referendum would require appendices and encyclopedia with the ballot paper for people to consult before they put their X on a ballot paper. Quite apart from that, the decision, which is implicit in all of these positions, is that the decision made by 17.4 million people just 2 years ago may be somehow overridden. That the binding referendum, which the Prime Minister, David Cameron, remember him, told us that the ballot box would bind the government's hands. They made it clear it was a one-off. It was a once-in-a-lifetime. They even spent £9 million of your money circulating everyone in the country, every household, telling you in that pamphlet that your decision would be final. Well, just 2 years on, the Labour Party no longer regards it as final. I happen to believe that Corbyn and McDonnell are right in that any referendum which reopened the substantive issue of whether Britain stays or goes from the EU would be a betrayal, not just of the 17.4 million, not just of the Labour Party manifesto on which they were elected in significantly increased numbers only a year ago, dear listener, but it would be a betrayal of democracy itself. The idea that we can vote in 2016 to leave the European Union and vote again in 2019 actually to be like Norway is fanciful in the extreme. It would have grave consequences for the credibility, the integrity of Britain's democratic system. And frankly, after the Iraq War, there's not many more blows that the integrity and credibility of our political system can take. It would be a dramatic fillip boost to the far right in British politics, to the street, brown-shirted right, and to the besuited white-collar variants of the British right. It would lend itself to a national narrative that Britain had been stabbed in the back, and moreover, stabbed in the back by Labour. 65% of all Labour-held parliamentary constituencies in the parliament we have today voted for Brexit. 5 million Labour voters voted for Brexit in a khaki election, dear listeners, one in which Theresa May wrapped herself in the Union flag and said this election is about Britain versus the EU, and its fifth column in the British Labour Party would be electorally catastrophic for a generation or perhaps forever for Labour. But the same water diviner would be required to point to the position of the ruling Conservative Party today as they go into their conference in Birmingham on Sunday. Where do they stand? And you'd need Mystic Meg to tell us where Britain stands. We're less than 6 months away from the most important political turn that Britain has taken since the Second World War. More important even than joining the common market in 1973. This will change the lives of everyone on this island, either for the better, as I believe, or for the worse, as many of you believe. But either way, it is a gigantic turning point, and less than 6 months to go, nobody at all, least of all, I believe, the Prime Minister, knows how it's going to work out. But hold on, who's that tilting at windmills on his donkey? Don Quixote? No, it's Boris Johnson. Thanks to his highly remunerative column in the Daily Telegraph, they gave over most of the newspaper to the Scribblings. £266,000 a year is the highest paid newspaper columnist in newspaper history. He has come to the rescue. Or has he? His plan is that Britain should be not just Canada, but Super Canada. Hyphenated Super Canada. If that was such a good idea, how come we're only finding out about it now? And what does it mean in any case? Well, according to Boris, it gives us tariff-free, barrier-free access to the European Union, but the super bit means removing the so-called backstop which is thought necessary to maintain partition between the 6 counties of the northeast of Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, which will remain in the European Union. There are many problems with Boris's plan, not the least of which is that the Ulster Unionists don't agree with it. And without the Democratic Unionist Party's 10 votes in Parliament, Theresa May no longer has a majority for anything at all, never mind Brexit. But we'll be exploring with considerable experts just what this Super Canada proposal actually means. The opinion polls don't look good for Labour. Most parties get a bounce out of their opinion poll rating after their conference. Labour has just dropped by 4 points, or 5, depending on which opinion poll you believe. Labour is now down to 36% in both of today's polls. I believe that's because, at the very least, they came out of their joyous, exultant epiphany at Liverpool with nobody quite knowing where they stand on the biggest issue in British politics. And what's going to happen in Birmingham? Last year, it was a disaster for Theresa May. She was struck down, much as I am this evening, with a cough and a cold and unable to actually be heard as she gave her leader's address, and such was the security in the conference that a prankster was able to come forward and literally hand her her P45. Will, at the Conservative conference this week, coming, a real P45 be in the post? Because make no mistake about it, Boris Johnson's démarche in the Telegraph today was not just to fill 4,000 words of the Daily Telegraph. It was a job application. It was a leadership bid in the offing. Now, the presumption of innocence is a very precious and important thing. It's quite often abandoned these days. In Britain, we have protections against the reckless flow of speculative information, which may not in the end be information. once people have been charged with criminal offences. On another night, I'll return to that point in another case. But in the United States, it's a full-blown three-ring circus over who should be appointed to the US Supreme Court. Now, it's come to something when British newspapers, including The Guardian, are not just leading with the story of Brett Kavanaugh, the nominee of Donald Trump for the Supreme Court vacancy in the United States, but the first three stories on the front page of The Guardian this evening are all on that subject. Anyone who heard the distraught, tortured, bereft, desolate evidence of the alleged victim of sexual assault by Brett Kavanaugh could not fail to have been moved. Well, unless you were a Republican senator, some of them did not seem to be moved. On the other hand, the testimony of Kavanaugh was also itself quite powerful. One of these two people is mistaken, to say the least. Which one it is riveting the United States and appears to be riveting our country too. I'm looking at 3 television screens and it's on all of them, all 3 of them. Is this another sign of how Americanized our lives have become? Or is it, as Dan Wooten pointed out earlier, because of the cross-oceanic cultural importance of the Me Too movement, where men who have for centuries, millennia, abused their positions of strength, to force themselves upon women. We'll be discussing that with some high-powered American guests too. We'll also be looking at Pret-a-Manger and the disastrous story of the baguette which killed a young girl on an aeroplane. Now, of course, you can call me 0344 499 1000, but you can also email me via the website at talkradio.co.uk. You can text me. Text the word TALK and then your message to 87222, though that will cost you 25 pence plus normal sending charges. You could tweet me for free at George Galloway, at Talk Radio. Don't forget to add both of us. And on Facebook, we're at facebook.com//Talk Radio UK. Now, I said earlier we're going to begin by talking about Canada. It's not always. I like Canada myself. I've spoken all over Canada, right up to the beyond the Arctic Circle, to Yellowknife itself, where it was 47 degrees below. I've given speeches in every part of Canada, appeared on all Canadian media. I like Canada, but for most people, it's not the centre of the world. It's not automatically what you'd hope Britain would become, though better Canada than the United States, I say. Boris Johnson wants us to be super Canada fragilocious, or whatever that phrase used to be. He wants us to have exactly the same relationship to the European Union after Brexit as Canada does. It's a bit late in the day, to be honest. It's a bit late in the day to be coming up with an entirely new schema. But Boris has been roundly criticised, maybe condemned is the word, for having resigned and gone fallow for a few weeks while he sorted out some domestic difficulties, but without advancing an alternative schema to Chequers. Well, that has now at least been remedied, because his Super Canada thesis, I think we can call it, was almost long enough to be a thesis, in the Telegraph this morning, passes for his alternative to Chequers. I heard somebody on the news, but I missed who it was. But what she was saying was correct. Chequers is dead in the water, which I told you here the very weekend that it was agreed. And you, I'm sure, will recall all those highly paid commentators who came on the show to tell me I was completely wrong and how it was, in fact, a triumph, and how the Prime Minister had dished her enemies and how Chequers would be embraced. I think Peter Oborne said the hills would be alive. Do you recall that? When she went to Salzburg, and Angela Merkel would give Theresa May a big hug and even a kiss, and that kiss would seal the deal. Well, everybody now knows that the Chequers deal is dead in the water, as I predicted. It cannot pass the House of Commons because the Labour opposition will vote it down, and they will be joined by at least 100 Conservative MPs who'd do the same. So it cannot pass the House of Commons. And more importantly, it can't pass the European Union, who have root and branch rejected it. They have said, in the words of Macron, that it's dead. So, you know, if it looks like a dead duck, walks like a dead duck, quacks like a dead duck, or rather doesn't quack, it's probably because it is a dead duck. So something has to come forward. Maybe this Super Canada idea is what it will be. You see, all these different formulae which are now being floated miss one really important point. If, for example, Emily Thornberry's schema of Britain as Norway were to be implemented, that would be worse, from my point of view, than remaining in the European Union in the first place, because Norway has no say in what the European Union decides, but it must accept everything that the European Union decides. It doesn't send members to the European Parliament. It doesn't have a seat at the Council of Ministers. It doesn't appoint commissioners to the EU bureaucracy, but it must accept everything that these three organs of EU power decide. And it also misses this. I'm sorry, because I know a lot of you listening don't like this. The reason why many people voted for Brexit was to bring about an end to one, at least, if not more than one, of the four pillars of the European Union. And that pillar was so-called free movement of cheap East and Central European labour into the British labour market. Millions of such workers came here, and an almost uncountable number of millions were entitled to, 350 million to be precise. Now, if you're really saying that we should leave the organs of the European Union but continue to accept free movement of cheap East and Central European labour, well, that'll cause a revolution in this country. I mean, it really does risk social peace because people voted against it. And if you're going to overturn it, if you can overturn it with just conference fiat, because that's what is being suggested here, the Labour Party's policy was cooked up. And in fact, when the cook brought it out of the oven, there were three different policies. Corbyn and MacDonald's policy, Keir Starmer's policy, and Emily Thornberry's policy. Talk about risking your entire political position. Now, first up to discuss what Boris means is a man for whom I have bottomless admiration. He's Professor Steve Keen. I follow him on Patreon. He is the world's first, or one of the world's first, and certainly the world's best, crowd-funded professors of economics. Isn't that amazing? I follow him every day, and I've learned more about economics. I got an A pass in economics when I was at school, in my SCE hires. I know a fair bit about economics, or at least I thought I did, until I started reading Professor Steve Keen. So if anyone can deconstruct what Boris Johnson meant, it was 4,000 words, it was at least 2,000 too many. If anyone can help us, it's Professor Steve Keen. Professor Steve Keen, I wait your every posting on patreon.com, and I urge others to do so. But I want to talk to you about Boris Johnson. It's time we had a talk about Boris. What does he even mean, Steve? Oh dear, we've lost Steve. I think he's in the US, but we'll try and get him back. Steve Keen will help us with what Super Canada actually means. And he'll tell us why, if it's such a good idea, we haven't heard about it before. Will Theresa May accept it? Will the Conservative rebels accept it? Will the Democratic Unionist Party accept it? And perhaps above all, will the European Union accept it? And if they don't accept this 11th hour démarche, which Boris is going to seek to rally the Conservative conference around, if he doesn't, what next? We really are running out of lunchtimes. One man who's got no time for lunchtimes is Professor Steve Keen. Steve, welcome to the show.
Good to be here, George.
What did Boris Johnson mean in the Telegraph today?
He meant he's running for Prime Minister.
Yeah, I mean, it is. It's a job application, isn't it? It's an election manifesto.
It's a job application. Yeah, but the beginning of it, rather than the laugh at George, it's the grandiose George in the first few paragraphs.
Well, grandiose is Boris, of course, but...
Pardon me, mate, sorry.
Tell me...
Just after dinner.
Tell me this. Can it fly, first of all?
Well, the reason it can't fly is because the European Union doesn't want any exit to fly, and this is one reason why I've been retweeting the tweet that Yanni sent out, repeating an article he wrote 2 years ago, saying here's what's going to happen in Brexit negotiations. The European Union doesn't want it to succeed. They'll give the Tories the runaround in 6 different ways, and what they should really do is say, give us a Norwegian deal, and we'll renew it in 7 years' time. Because they haven't done that, then everything Yanni said would happen in that article 2 years ago has transpired.
But the Norwegian deal is worse than remaining in the European Union. You get all the decisions made by the EU and have no say in making them. And above all, you have to accept continued free movement of labour.
Well, you don't get to do all the regulation controls and stuff like that, but then they can't tell you your fiscal policy, they can't tell you your monetary policy. And so long as you're away from that, I don't mind them having control over other aspects. They can't also tell you what to do in terms of labour rules. So, I think just getting... If you try to negotiate with the European Union, Yannis's message was they will stuff you up, and that's precisely what's happened. So at the end of it, it looks like the only thing we're going to do is get a hard exit. And the real disaster there, of course, I think is nothing to do with economic policy. It's Northern Ireland.
Well, you see, you're not bothered about free movement of labour because there's not two Steve Keens. You're not going to be competing with a Bulgarian, Czechoslovak, Slovenian, Slovakian, Romanian. You're not competing for work with them. But many millions that voted for Brexit are competing for their jobs and their wages and their rents and their public services with these workers. And that's why a Norway deal could set fire to this country, Steve.
Well, actually, you know better than I do, George. I don't know the details of the Norway deal. I was thinking going on Yannis's comment from 2 years ago. So if Norway allows free movement, then I'm equally with you on that front. I think free movement weakens labour. And that's how it's been used by neoliberals all around the world. So, yes, okay, not the free movement side of it.
Yeah, well, they're unmovable on that, Steve.
I'm quite in agreement with you on that.
Yeah, they're unmovable on that. If you're going to have membership of the European Economic Area, whilst it would be easier at airports for people going to Malaga on holiday, you'd still have to compete with the cheap labour coming in from EU countries. And that's why I believe that's a non-starter. What is Canada's deal with the EU? Can you tell us that?
No, I don't know. Again, this is one of these things. I don't worry much about trade, George. I worry far more about investment, which matters a lot more. And I think all the fascinations with trade that's something politicians can actually go and sign documents on. I think they're being important. What matters is boosting the level of investment in your country, or UK is right down the very bottom of the OECD. So I'm just particularly not fussed about trade deals. I think what actually matters is getting this country reindustrialised. And to some extent, getting away from the European Union was necessary to do that because the European Union is such a neoliberal program. It doesn't worry about industrialisation. And, of course, Germany has industrialised at the expense of the rest of the continent. Luckily, Britain didn't suffer that fate because it didn't join the euro itself. But I'd like to see something that got this country focusing on investment and developing technology again.
What's wrong with the WTO rules? What's wrong with us saying we're leaving and we'll trade with you on WTO rules?
Not a lot. I mean, again, if you go back 40 or 50 years, tariffs were of the average level about 30%. So if you went to something which wasn't a specially negotiated lower deal, then you really did suffer. These days, tariffs, on the average in most countries are about 2 to 3%. Only in a few extraordinary industries do you get tariffs of the order of 30%. Things like textiles, car manufacturing gets about 10%. That wouldn't make a great deal of difference, and most of the time manufacturers absorb those tariff effects to try to hang on to their sales margins.
Now, finally, Professor, Boris Johnson, indefatigable. You couldn't take that away from him.
Indeed.
This is a bounce back by him because he's been criticised for his silence over the last weeks since he resigned from the cabinet. Have you got any idea how many supporters this Super Canada deal that he's floated might have in the Conservative Party?
No, not in terms of what you can certainly see is the Conservatives are worried hell about going to the next election with May. And the only reason I think May is hanging on is because if they lose the Ulster vote, the Ulsterite members of Parliament, then they are in a minority and an election is called straight away. So that's the only reason. It's a bit like a poison pill that's kept May alive. But I think at the same time they realise that they're going to compete with Corbyn at the next election. They need somebody who can actually campaign. And one thing was proven by the last election is categorically May cannot do that.
Very interesting. Professor Steve Keen, thank you indeed very much. We have a Canadian expert, I hope, lined up. He is Peter MacKay, a QC, a partner in the Baker McKenzie Toronto office. It's a multinational law firm, but most importantly, he was crucially involved in the negotiation of NAFTA. If anybody knows what Super Canada is, it's him. Now, my next guest is possibly the most important Canadian I have ever addressed. He's Peter MacKay, or MacKay as he'd be called back in the old country, previously a member of the Privy Council, QC for the Canadian Parliament for over 18 years, and recently served as Canada's Attorney General and Minister of Justice from 2013 to 2015. He also knows a thing or two, or 10,000, about the NAFTA trade deal between Canada, the United States and Mexico. So who better to turn to talk about Boris Johnson's Super Canada deal than Peter MacKay. Peter, thanks very much for joining us.
My pleasure, George. You've said some very complimentary things.
Well, they're all factual. What about the pronunciation of your surname? Of course, here, for someone like me, you'll always be Peter MacKay.
Yeah, the MacKay is the proper pronunciation in the Highlands. Somehow it got deviated, I guess, a bit here in the colonies.
Yes.
But I'll answer to both.
Thanks for that, Peter. Now, you're probably aware that the former Foreign Secretary and putative Prime Minister Boris Johnson has prayed your country's name in vain, or not, in the Daily Telegraph at some length today. He says Britain should be to the European Union, a kind of super Canada. Can you help us with what he might mean by that? Because his prose is somewhat prolix, and not many people are much the wiser having read it.
Well, I'm not sure if I'm able to interpret Boris Johnson on that or anything for that matter. But speaking of trade with the European Union from a North American perspective or a Canadian perspective, we do have what's known as the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement, which took us 7 years, frankly, George, to get to that place.
Wow.
Not fully implemented as yet, but nevertheless, it would be the equivalent of a free trade agreement similar to what we have with the United States and Mexico. But let me put down a marker. We are in the negotiation of a very hotly contested renegotiation of NAFTA, as you probably know.
Yeah, Trump is behaving very oddly, meanly towards Canada. It seems you've joined some kind of axis of evil.
Yeah, he singled out our foreign minister for some derision at the United Nations this week. NAFTA is really in jeopardy. But, coming back to your question, Boris Johnson is not wrong to suggest that that type of relationship is possible. I'm not sure, given the politics of what's going on through Brexit right now. I don't pretend to be an expert there. But what I'd like to really introduce into the discussion is how Canada and the United Kingdom could enter into a free trade agreement, because many of the same conditions going back years of the relationship that we had with the United States that led to the initial free trade agreement with the Americans applies to the United Kingdom. And I think it's an idea that has really come to the forefront now. We should be doing much more trade and free trade between Canada and the United Kingdom.
Well, I'm with you on that. One of the reasons why I supported Brexit was so we could re-engage with Commonwealth countries, many of which, including your own, are very powerful and important economies now in the world. But just tell me, because I'm not at all an expert, what's the difference between Canada's relationship to the EU and the oft-quoted demand here that we should leave the EU and trade with it under WTO rules? What are the principal differences between the Canada deal and a simple WTO deal?
Well, that's hard to unpack with specifics, George, and I say that because our comprehensive economic trade agreement is not fully in force as yet. But some of the more contentious issues, I think, that may exist in the EU example with Britain pertain to jobs and the ability to have free flow of employment. There are certain products, certain sectors that may be looking for carve-outs. We got into a bit of a bun fight with the European Union over our dairy because we have a protected system known as supply management. But we were able to, as you should in a proper free trade agreement, allow for some give and take. So we were giving up certain points as part of the negotiation. And so on certain products, whether it be timber, whether it be auto, aerospace and defense, the ultimate goal is to bring down as many tariffs as possible. This is where we're getting wrapped around the axle with the United States. There's parts of the existing NAFTA that now have become too contentious. A dispute resolution mechanism, for example. Again, the dairy issue. The president has put tariffs on steel and aluminum, which is contrary to the existing NAFTA. So we're negotiating, frankly, with a gun to our head right now with the United States. That's not the goodwill and the type of friendly environment that you want to try to get to a final agreement. And I dare say, and I'm going out on a limb perhaps in mentioning this, but there seems to be a political dynamic and a great deal of animosity that has not dissipated to the point where you could probably have the type of agreement that Canada has with the European Union, at least not at this point.
Well, a number of hauntingly familiar themes arise from what you've just said. Many people in Britain think we're negotiating with the EU with a gun to our head. And the ill will that now exists between the United States and Canada is comparable in some regards to what many believe is the ill will on the part of the European Union, not against Britain per se, but against anyone leaving the club. Now, the two salient points for me in what you just said were, first of all, that it took you 7 years to reach this agreement. This is being floated here in Britain less than 6 months before we actually leave. So comment, please, on the disjunction of that. And secondly, you said that Canada had to give up certain things in order to reach agreement on dairy, I think you said. Could you give us an indication of what kind of things you did have to give up? Did you have to give up more than it was worth, in your view?
Well, we're not there yet, George, is the short answer. We hope to get to an agreement. Mexico has been willing to compromise far more than we have to date, and therefore they have an agreement, and we don't. And the clock is now ticking because, as is the case in North America and in Europe and the UK, you have this overlay of political pressures and deadlines and looming elections and groups, countries, parties that sometimes tend to drop out. What some are seeing these dynamics is like getting in the case of Brexit, it's like getting a divorce but having sleeping privileges. I'm not sure that we're going to be able to get past some of the demands that the Americans are putting on us, and I'll list them as you've requested. The dispute resolution mechanism, which is a way that you have a trilateral panel when these disputes arise. We've had problems in terms of our softwood lumber, and the Americans feel that it's subsidized and therefore unfair. And yet these dispute resolution panels have continuously found in our favor, which is why the Americans want to get rid of it. E-commerce has now become a contentious issue. Protecting certain cultural identities in Canada is something our government has put forward, which I don't agree with, frankly. And the other thing that they've been pushing is these progressive agenda, which would insert climate change, Indigenous rights, more equality provisions into a trade deal. There's been pushback on that, as we saw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations and Chinese negotiations. So all of that to say, it is incredibly complex, but the relationship and the political dynamic are what very often pull these things through. Our former Prime Minister Mulroney had a very good personal relationship with Ronald Reagan. That saved NAFTA in the initial round. That got it to the point where they were able to make the sufficient compromises to close the deal. We clearly don't have that dynamic anymore between Canada and the United States, and arguably nobody does with the current president.
Well, undoubtedly, and we don't have it with the European Union. The more you spoke, the more I saw, and not just for the mop of blondish hair, in a way, Johnson is setting himself up as the Donald Trump of Britain in that. I know you're far too judicious to comment on that, but it seems to me, listening to you, that it's unlikely that this Canada deal is going to be the answer to our prayers, given how little time there is between now and the witching hour. As I said, less than 6 months. So wish us well, please, Mr. MacKay.
I certainly do, George. And Liam Fox is somebody who I've worked closely with in the past. I know he's working very hard at this as well. But look, these trade deals don't come together quickly unless you have a tremendous amount of goodwill, and there is some of these trade negotiators who have done a deep dive into all of these provisions to sort it out before it goes public. And once it starts being negotiated in the public sphere, much, much more difficult to close.
Very interesting indeed. I'm deeply grateful to you, sir, for joining us. Peter MacKay, or MacKay, former Privy Councillor and QC for the Canadian Parliament for over 18 years, and a man deeply involved in the negotiations around the NAFTA, which, as he said, has now effectively broken down. So there was a free trade area between Canada, the United States and Mexico. Donald Trump ran for office on a promise to renegotiate it, and if he couldn't renegotiate it successfully, to scrap it. And that's in a way what he has done. Mexico has bent over backwards to please the president, but that hasn't so far saved them from the prospect of a wall being built along their border. Canada has become a kind of bête noire for the Trump administration, with scathing and very personal attacks on the Canadian Prime Minister and Foreign Minister. Indeed, Canada's in the dock, I see today, with Saudi Arabia also. Canada looking a little bit isolated in the world today. No one came to its side in the row about Saudi Arabia, and no one is standing up for Canada in the bullying, frankly, by Donald J. Trump over the NAFTA. So where does all this leave us? Johnson wants us to be a Canada, but Canada took 7 years and has still not finalised its trading relationship with the European Union. We don't even have 7 months. So let's take a call. Let's take Yanni in Swansea. Go ahead, Yanni.
Oh, hello, George. Yeah, listen, I was ringing to kind of disagree with you, but not exactly. Just to pick up on a couple of things. Something that came up in today's program, and also a couple of things you mentioned in on some previous programs prior to 1973, when you commented that Britain was apparently in a way better situation. But on today's program, the Norway style arrangement. Varoufakis has actually pointed out in a little bit more nuanced way about going to Norway, whereas I think you're kind of making it sound as though that's what we'd be left with. He's not saying that. He has always said that we should have immediately defaulted to that, which would have been the least amount of change from the prior situation, and then maybe spend a 5 or 7 year period without the gun to our head, 6 months down the track, it's all got to be decided, that then we can debate it calmly and properly, and could even legislate that.
Well, look, we'll pick that issue up after the news, Yanni, but we don't have, of course, very much time left. Now, Yanni in Swansea very kindly agreed to stay on the line. My bad, Yanni. I didn't realise how close we were to the news when I called you. If I can summarise, correct me if I'm wrong, your view, as is indeed Yanis Varoufakis, the former finance minister in the Syriza government in Greece, his view, your view, is that we should take a Norway deal for a prescribed amount of time. You said 7 years, and negotiate in that 7 years whatever terms, whatever government we have in mind. Have I summarised that properly?
Almost. I'm not rusted onto that idea. I'm not necessarily. I'm still a bit undecided as to whether that would be the best option. However, I just wanted to clarify and point out that that is the option or the position that Varoufakis is making, and that it's not.
He wants us to remain in the European Union.
Well, he campaigned for it, but he's also adamant about there being no second referendum. He's ultimately a Democrat. He's very adamant about that, and he suggested that instead of this situation where I mean, like let's face it, you've been saying yourself, 6 months. It's like you've got an exam, you've got your A-level exam to study for 2 years, and you've left till the night before.
It's the equivalent. It's the equivalent of that. Yeah.
And his suggestion was that you should have instantly just parked it into like a transitional exit, and the first step in a transition would be Norway. But that doesn't mean it has to be a permanent situation, and that then the Parliament, being sovereign, can debate, legislate, and then guarantee the people what they voted for, and then people, taking the Brexit further. So I just wanted to clarify that first. Now, I can see the logic in that. I'm not 100% sure whether I agree with him, though, but I just wanted to sort of clarify that point.
As one way out, yeah. I'll tell you why I think it's dead in the water, that one. because
Okay.
a Norway deal requires us to continue to accept what they call the free movement of labour, what I call the free movement of cheap labour, which puts pressure on wages. One of my friends, Christina, on Twitter was making the point that the minimum wage applies. Well, it does usually, but not always. But the point is the general level of wages is depressed by an increased supply of labour. That's simple economics. You don't need Professor Steve Keen to teach you that. So if you have an elastic supply of labour, the price of labour goes down. If you have an elastic supply of tenants, the price of rents go up. And if you have an elastic supply of people who require access to public services, you by definition have greater pressure on public services. Now, many people on the left say, well, if we had strong trade unions, they could stop this pressure, downward pressure on wages. We could stop an upward pressure on rents. If we had a government that would spend properly on public services, we could have more public services, to which I always reply, in the words of the late and great Bob Crow, the former leader of the RMT, if my auntie had a beard, she'd be my uncle. We don't have strong trade unions. We don't have a government that is going to spend big on public services. And we don't have a government that's going to build millions of council houses that would be required to bring rent levels down. Last word to you, Yanni.
Well, that's a problem whether we're in the EU or not. So we just basically have to get a Corbyn government, regardless. So, and I understand what you're saying about then that the free movement of labour is an issue, definitely. But again, that notion that Varoufakis put forward is that doesn't have to remain that way. It could be 5 years, it could be less. We could do whatever we wanted.
It would be a never-endum then, Yanni. We'd be talking...
We vote governments in, and we have them for 4 years.
Yeah, but it would be, wouldn't it turn into a never-endum? We had a referendum, then we had 2 years of talking about it, and then another 7 years of talking about it.
Well, it doesn't have to be 7. It could be 3. We could do whatever we wanted. I mean, I understand what you're saying. It would risk that, and people who really still wanted to campaign and continue with Brexit would have to be vigilant and make their case. However, I see the logic. I just see the logic that it would take this ridiculous time pressure off, that it is a massive decision, and that I can see. And I just wanted to point out mainly that that's what he was suggesting.
Yeah, good. You've talked a lot of sense, Yanni in Swansea. Thanks for holding on, especially. What do you think about that? What do you think about Yanni's suggestion of a short term, maybe 3, maybe 7 years in the EEA, in the Norway option? Do you agree with him or do you agree with me? 0344 499 1000. Now, we're still talking about that, but we must, again, I'm looking at 3 television screens and somebody called Brett Kavanaugh, about whom no one had ever heard in this island until a couple of weeks ago, is on every single television screen. It's partly because we are, I think, increasingly fixated by the Beltway at the Potomac and what's happening in Washington, in American governance. But it's partly also because of the issue that has perhaps derailed the appointment of the said Brett Kavanaugh to the United States Supreme Court. Lee Stranahan is a broadcaster, investigative journalist, former Breitbart reporter, and former friend, at least, of Steve Bannon. So he's probably got a point of view. Let's hear it. Lee, welcome to the show.
Hey, George. Thanks for having me. Great to be on.
Why is everyone so caught up in this issue? I could see in the committee room it was quite high drama. But first of all, tell us why it's important. Which judge sits on the Supreme Court?
Well, this is the second time that Donald Trump has been able to nominate someone to the Supreme Court. And the first one was controversial because it was to replace Judge Scalia, a conservative judge, who died when President Obama was still in place. But because of the system we have in the United States, the president nominates, but then it needs to go through a Senate approval process. And the Republican-held Senate, when Obama was president, was not going to approve whoever Obama put through. So that first nomination was really for filling in for Scalia, was taking a very conservative judge and replacing him. The second one that Kavanaugh is filling in for is replacing a judge who retired on purpose because they were older. These are, Supreme Court positions are lifetime, right?
Yeah,
and
don't they normally die with their boots on?
That's exactly right. And one of Kennedy, a big swing vote, said, "I'm going to retire now," and so that created this second opening for someone who's likely to be more conservative. You never know when people get on the court, things change, but likely to be more conservative. So this seemed to be going along the way you would expect with a Republican president and Republican Senate. And with a fairly Kavanaugh was not a he's a fairly non-interesting. He's not a bomb thrower. He's not a radical. He's a conservative. Yeah, he's on the right. But as far as American politics go, the guy's sort of an establishment conservative. He's not really a controversial pick. It didn't seem. Then this allegation came up. And there's one of the issues here is that this is the first time that anyone I know can remember at all, ever in American history, where what somebody did in high school, this guy's 53, okay? What somebody did in high school, literally they were testifying, they were asking him questions about what's in his high school yearbook page when the guy was 17 years old, right? That's weird. And that's new in American politics because if you think about it, if that's the principle, a lot of people are going to be in trouble. If you're going to go by what people did when they were 17 or whatever, even if it's true, that's a weird situation.
But if it's true, Lee, I mean, not only would he not be fit to be a Supreme Court judge, he wouldn't be fit to be a judge, and perhaps he should be in front of a judge. Bill Cosby's just gone inside for 3 to 10 for that kind of thing, albeit committed when he was a big star and an adult. But there's no statute of limitations on these things. I mean, if true, the allegations are really very serious.
Well, let's just take the first accuser because that's really the most serious, and it has no corroborating proof whatsoever. And this is one of the issues. This is a woman who came forward, but I was going to say at the last minute, but more importantly, and this is a big part of the anger on the part of, you saw it yesterday from Lindsey Graham, who you don't normally see that side of. He was furious. And the reason he was furious, George, is that Dianne Feinstein, the Democrat from California, had a letter from this woman in July. And what they did was, rather than even if she had told the Republicans, hey, I have an allegation from this woman, the FBI would have investigated it back in July and August. Instead, she waited until a week before the vote and then didn't even tell Republicans until then. So procedurally, usually, what you're supposed to do is share that information as soon as possible so the FBI can investigate. What they did here was they held it off. Then they accused the Republicans, oh, well, now you don't want to investigate. And the Republicans said, and I believe that they meant it, that they absolutely would have investigated this 2 months ago. Part of the reason this is happening now, let's be really clear, is we're about to have what we call the midterm elections in the U.S. That's in about less than 45 days, okay? These midterm elections determine the fate of Congress, of the Senate and the House. And so they're very important. This is a move by the Democrats. I'm not even judging it. I'm not a Democrat. I'm a Republican. But this is a move by them to try to bolster themselves before the midterms.
So your thesis is they're playing politics with people's lives, his life and her life.
Well, right. And here's the thing. If the Democrats can scuttle this nomination, right, by any means necessary, and then the president has to nominate someone new, there would be a possibility, a strong possibility, that if the Senate switched hands, the president would be stuck. So in other words, he wouldn't be. So in other words, them scuttling this nomination, very important for them politically, because it's the only shot they have of retaking the Senate and getting somebody who's not conservative at all, somebody who's a moderate on the Supreme Court. So that's what's at stake for the Democrats, and that's a lot of what's going on. But a lot of the anger here is that there is literally not a shred of corroborating evidence for what this woman said.
Well, that's often the case, of course, in rape and sexual assault cases. Quite often, there's only the believability of the victim as opposed to the believability of the alleged perpetrator. I mean, that's not unusual. And Lee, I mean, if the Democrats are playing politics, aren't the Republicans playing politics too? After all, there's no great rush for this Supreme Court vacancy to be filled, is there? They could have, even now they could, put the vote on hold until after the elections, when the thing could be more calmly returned to.
Well, actually, technically, there is a real reason for it, and here's what it is. Right now, a lot of court decisions have basically come down to a one-vote majority. If there's nobody on the court, it is about to be too late. In other words, you have to nominate a judge now, or they're not going to be on the next session, the next season of court appearances. Does that make sense? So in other words, if they don't qualify, they don't get to. You don't have you got a split court for the next session.
This is all a result of the politicization of justice in the U.S., isn't it? I mean, nobody knows what the politics of British judges are. And, of course, there's no politics involved in appointing them.
Well, that's one of the great, when Kavanaugh's hearing first started, there was a usual protest, but a lot of the discussion was about, do you think the judicial branch should be politicized? And we like to pretend in America that it's not politicized. It is everybody knows. It's an open secret. You could see that in Bush v. Gore, for instance, and again, Republicans won that. It's obviously politicized. So we like to have the illusion. We like to pretend in America that that's not really what's going on. So there's a lot of, early in Kavanaugh's testimony, a lot of beautiful talk back and forth about, oh, no, we would never politicize the judicial branch. And then this happened, and this is, I'll tell you, George, everybody I talk to gets this same sense. This was a historic watershed moment in American politics. Everyone was
Which way
watching.
is it going to break then, Lee?
Well, here's the way it looks like. He's out of committee now. He's out of committee. There was some question about Jeff Flake, who's a Republican. He's leaving the Senate. He's a lame duck. So now the question is, can they sway the votes? Now, here's what to watch for. If you don't think operatives and private investigators and the media on the left and the right are going to be going mental about that this weekend, if any new evidence in this story breaks, something to prove her wrong or him wrong, watch for that, because I think a lot of these votes are that close.
And the impact on the broader electorate for the 45-day from now midterms?
I believe it has energized the Republicans. I think if you were a Republican and you hated the Democrats on a scale of 1 to 10, about an 8, as the great British band Spinal Tap put it, they've just gone to 11. But what's happened is the people who didn't like Kavanaugh liked him less today. The people who liked Kavanaugh like him a lot more today, and vice versa. But Republicans, their hatred of Democrats right now, I have never seen anything like it, because they feel the Democrats have proved. And by the way, the other thing that's going on here, George, is we've got a very credible accusation, recent accusation, against a guy named Keith Ellison, who's the co-chair of the Democratic Party and a congressman. His girlfriend says that she filed medical reports and everything else, that he abused her, beat her. Now, he's a sitting congressman and the head of the DNC. But the Democrats absolutely don't want to talk about that story at all. And that story's been buried in the media. Very little coverage in the U.S. But the Democrats have their own issue here with sexual assault. And I think that if the Republicans start to play on that issue, which I can see them starting to, that could really change the dynamic in the midterms as well.
Is this revenge for what happened to Bill Clinton?
No, you know what? I think this is more revenge for what happened with Merrick Garland, who is the nominee who Obama put up that the Republicans wouldn't even hear. But I also think that this is part of a move by the Democrats to keep power and affect the midterms as much as they can. That's all they're trying to do. You got to understand, as much as Donald Trump is mocked in the media and everything else, the economy in the U.S. is strong right now, and often that's what affects voters, right? Often that's what they any voter anywhere. If the economy's good, okay, let's keep the incumbents. And so the economy's very good in the U.S. right now, and so the Democrats actually have an uphill battle getting rid of Trump right now, because despite what you see in the media, things are going pretty well in the issues that affect voters the most. I don't agree with the president on foreign policy a lot, and I think our American foreign policy is a disaster. But again, I'm just realistic about what moves voters.
Yeah. Breaking on CNN, the Judiciary Committee voted 11-10 along party lines to advance the nomination.
Yep.
What does that mean?
Yep. That means he's out of committee, and it could come up for a vote as soon as a few days. But Jeff Flake has said he is not going to vote for Kavanaugh until there's an FBI investigation. Now, the question is, you may not need Flake. If you get a Democrat, one Democrat, so that's why I say you get about 5 people, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans who are on the fence. Okay, you get about 4 or 5 people. Flake is the half a person there. He's sort of on the fence, but there's 2 others. So if new news breaks this weekend, that's what I say. We're out
one way or another. Yeah,
that's right.
She did pass a polygraph, of course. Is any due weight being put on that, Lee?
There's a lot of questions about the polygraph. Let me give you another example. Her therapist notes are key. They were given to the Washington Post by somebody, but the Republicans don't have them. The Republicans requested the therapist notes, right? So there's information about some of this stuff that the Republicans, this is why they're furious, because they feel like the Democrats were really playing games with the procedure on this and trying to drop in stuff at the last minute. So it couldn't be investigated properly. So you couldn't do an investigation. So you then run out the clock. That's what they feel like, and they're right. That really does seem to be what's happened. And that's why there's so much animosity. But I'm telling you, if news breaks, if something comes, anything, either way, that makes the story more definitive, that could sway those votes completely. Most people are locked in. Most Democrats are against it. A couple of Democrats, a woman from North Dakota, a couple others, a guy from West Virginia. They're in strongly pro-Trump states. So even though they're Democrat, officials, they're the swing votes here.
Now, I've appeared, as you know, before the Senate. I wasn't that impressed by them, and I haven't been that impressed by them watching what I have been able to see this week. The thing that struck me about Kavanaugh was the intemperate way in which he spoke. Maybe that's just 2 nations divided by a common language. But I kind of don't expect a judge to be intemperate. Admittedly, if he's innocent, he's got much to be angry about. But nonetheless, he did kind of lose his rag a bit, Lee.
Well, it's what you said. He is what he said later was that, and he's correct. If he gets on the court, it doesn't make any difference if he gets on the court or not. This is going to stick. This accusation is going to stick with him forever, right? Yeah. So, from his perspective, if he's innocent of it, and by the way, and I talked to someone today who said, well, they need to nominate somebody with a clean record. This guy's record is as clean as they can be. There was no accusation, no criminal charge, no nothing. This only came up from the accuser, Dr. Ford. The first time it came up with anybody else, and she didn't even mention Kavanaugh, was 2012, this idea of this assault. And she didn't mention Kavanaugh until recently. So that whole thing. Now, by the way, let me say this. Dr. Ford's testimony was very compelling because of how genuinely emotional she seemed. I talked to very few people who watched her testimony who said, she's just lying. They felt like something had happened, but they don't know, but she's misrepresented it or something. But you could not help but watch her testimony and feel like she's genuinely feeling emotion about this. And so that aspect of it has been very interesting to watch, because it's blurred some traditional party lines. But I will say, that being said, a lot of Republicans then go, there were parts of her testimony, clearly inconsistencies, where she didn't remember things that she should have, and she made claims about, like, well, she couldn't fly out for the testimony. And it turns out she flies all the time. She's a frequent flyer. And so there were little things like that bothered people. But
here's a text from Mal in Belfast. He says, George, furthermore, if Kavanaugh's nomination is pulled, it would open the same argument again against Trump. So, of course, the Republicans have to push it through. You must be worried as a Republican-leaning fellow that the Republican motif, if you like, gets fixed in the public's mind as the party of sexual abuse of women.
Well, actually, it's going to be very hard to top the party of Bill Clinton, Anthony Weiner, John Edwards, Ted Kennedy. It's a very, very difficult party to top. But
yeah, but you don't have an audio recording of President Clinton talking in the way the barrack room, the locker room banter, as he called it, about grabbing women.
Well, that's a word I believe Bill Clinton has used in his life before, and I think but really, when you have things like the Anthony Weiner scandal, a major U.S. Democratic congressman who's very close to the Clintons. Look, let's go beyond the partisan thing here. Part of the reason this was also galvanizing is because of the Me Too movement. We're at a moment where, thank God, the history of humankind of sexual abuse, especially against women, you and I both know, and everybody listening knows, if you talk to most women you know, they've had some sort of weird, bad experience, whether it's rape or a childhood abuse or something.
It's a man thing. Men have for millennia molested and used their power to overcome women and force themselves upon women. It's not a party political point generally, but as you know, in politics, perception is everything. I'm just wondering if at this moment in time, any women are going to vote Republican in 45 days' time.
Well, I don't think it's got any effect. What's interesting is the people who've been most harsh on this that I've heard are women. When they look at Dr. Ford's testimony, the people who've been the most like, look, she's lying, or have been women. If you believed her, but again, the big problem the Democrats have right now is this is an actual. Keith Ellison's running for the Attorney General of Minnesota right now, and he's a co-chair of the DNC. So this is the standard that they're using. It can be immediately used against them. They don't need to wait for the next scandal. They've got the scandal right now, and that's why I say this is a very tricky. It was very. I'll put it like this: but Trump's womanizing was very hard for Hillary Clinton to argue about, because everybody knows Bill Clinton's history, right, and how she defended him. And so I said this before. If you've been Bernie Sanders versus Trump, that would have ended it. I think that would have ended it right there. But because Hillary Clinton, she's defended Bill Clinton after what we all know now he did, very, very hard. So the problem the Democrats have is they can't, and they also have a history of backing some false allegations that have happened. There's a case called the Duke Lacrosse case, very famous in the U.S., was one of these big things. Here's the accusation, looks really bad, turns out completely false. Now everyone admits it was false. So we've had these before. So again, that's the other problem with any sexual assault allegation is, as much as there has been the history of abuse that you say that I'm glad is starting to end. I'm glad for the Me Too movement. But there is also a history of some women lie. And that's happened too. That's a real thing that's happened in some cases.
Well, let's hear what our women listeners in particular think of it. 0344 499 1000. That's the number to call. Lee Stranahan, I'm very grateful for your time. You've been very generous with it and helped us set the scene for a debate here on this subject. Lee, always a pleasure. Now, where do you stand on what you've just been hearing from Washington about the Brett Kavanaugh circus? The circus is confected, maybe, but the issues that are raised are very, very real. I restate my position. It matters not a jot if this happened when Kavanaugh was 17 years old, because it goes to his character. It goes to his probity. It goes to his righteousness. And if you have no credibility, how can you be a high court judge? How can you be a Supreme Court judge? And for life. That's my point of view. And therefore, it seems to me obvious that you cannot, in the teeth of these allegations, merely proceed to a hands-up-for-dumpling vote motivated by political considerations on the floor of the Senate. The police, the FBI, must, as they always ought, and we've heard from Lee Stranahan the reasons why they couldn't be, but now that this has happened, it's unconscionable to me. Certainly would be, I think, in the British system if we had one, if we had a constitution, if we had the ability to approve or not approve people being appointed to the High Court in Britain and the Supreme Court in Britain. It would certainly be put on ice at the very least until the allegations were properly investigated. But that doesn't seem to be what is going to happen unless, as Lee said, there are breaking news stories over the weekend, and I don't know about you, but I got the feeling he kind of suspected that there might be, which would change the dynamic of this story. So I want your point of view on it, particularly if you're a woman caller, and particularly if you're a first-time caller, and above all, particularly if you disagree with me. 0344 499 1000. That's the number to call. And how it works is you call us, and then we call you back, so it needn't cost you more than a penny or two. We're also still discussing Brexit and what we're going to do about that ticking clock. The clock is not just ticking, it's racing towards a witching hour, and we still have no real idea of where the government stands, where the opposition stands, and where Britain stands in relation to the EU. Now, Boris Johnson has projected one plan, the Super Canada plan laid out at length in the Daily Telegraph today. Yanni from Swansea was articulating a point of view that we're now attributing to Yanis Varoufakis, the former finance minister in the Syriza government in Greece. Greece, of course, very seriously affected by the EU and the European Central Bank, and how Greece was crushed by both and driven into penury, widespread penury, half the country in poverty, half the young people in the country unemployed, pensioners unable to keep body and soul together. Yannis's view is we should go for the Norway option. It's my view that that is worse than staying in the EU, and that's saying something coming from me. Here's Dee in Dulwich, always interested in this subject and always interesting to hear. Dee, welcome back.
Oh, hello there, George. Listen, as you know, I agree totally and utterly with you on Brexit. The sooner we come out of Europe, the better. So I've talked to you in the past where you've reassured me that Corbyn, feels the same. But, what you've told me is he can't move now. He, has to have his time. He's kind of watch it and, he'll do it in the right time and so forth, which I actually find hard to swallow because, if this was Tony Benn, he'd have declared it, shouted out to everybody and stood proud. Now, I've just been looking at the conference where Keir Starmer and all these bourgeois middle-class people have actually told Corbyn that he's going to be having a vote. When I spoke to you, you said, no, he's not going to go for a vote. Well, it's going that way. There isn't going to be an election because the Conservatives aren't going to allow you to have an election or allow Corbyn to have an election. And I'm just wondering how you can continue to support Corbyn, knowing...
Well, who else can I support, Dee?
Well,
Theresa May?
You have to admit it.
You want me to support Theresa May?
Look, do you know what, George? If you did, then all we needed to do, because that's the biggest issue in this country today. We are. It doesn't matter who you vote for because we're still stuck in Europe. Once we're out of Europe, then I'm quite happy to vote for a weak Corbyn. But right now, we need to get out of Europe, and Corbyn isn't going to do it. I mean, he looked even weaker when he went off to see Macron. I mean, that just made him such I just don't understand it. And I don't understand why, because there's nobody else, you push to vote to him.
Well, that's always the case. I've spent my whole life, except when I was a candidate, voting for the least worst candidate. So there's nothing unusual about that, Dee.
But isn't the least worst candidate somebody that will take us out of Europe?
Well, the position that was articulated, again, not very clearly, but again, at the Liverpool conference by both Corbyn and McDonnell was that they accepted the result of the 2016 referendum and that therefore any new vote which they refused to take off the table, they didn't commit themselves to one, but they refused to take it off the table, would be on the terms of the exit, not on the substantive motion of leaving the EU. But you're quite right. The water was comprehensively muddied by Sir Keir Starmer, not just telling Corbyn what he told him, but telling the media that John McDonnell had been mistaken because he'd been up too early.
And what did John McDonnell do? Did he come back with
he didn't. No, he didn't.
They're all
Sir
weak.
Keir told...
Do you know why they're weak? You know why they're weak? Because they all of the people that are supporting them are disagreeing with them. They can't. They are running a whole bunch of bourgeoisie, momentum, middle-class guys who are never, ever going to agree with them. So what is the point in them? There isn't going to be an election because the Conservatives aren't going to give them one. They're going to be there for the next... There might be a change of leader in the Conservative Party, but there's never, ever going to be... Who's going to give them an election?
Well, if Theresa May finds it impossible to get any deal through Parliament, which I've been predicting for 2 years.
Right, you have, yes.
Then we'll have a no-deal Brexit.
Right,
a no-deal Brexit supported by a tiny, tiny number of members of Parliament. That will create conditions in which the demand for a general election will be very powerful indeed. It doesn't mean we'll get one. As you rightly say, it doesn't mean we'll get one, but a motion of no confidence in the Prime Minister in those circumstances would be quite difficult to resist. And the arithmetic, as you know, is so very tight. I mean, all it would take was flights not to take off from Belfast that day, and the government could fall. And I've been in these situations before. I was a Labour Party official when Jim Callaghan's government fell in 1979, and as you know, it fell by one vote. So these things can happen. But I take your point. The election is by no means a foregone conclusion. The result of any election is by no means a foregone conclusion. British politics is in a state of great flux. And you have a choice. You vote for Vince Cable to be Prime Minister, Theresa May to be Prime Minister, or Boris Johnson, or Michael Gove, or Jeremy Hunt, or you vote for Jeremy Corbyn to be Prime Minister.
After that conference, I think myself, and I'm sure many, many like me, are going to vote for Theresa May, or anybody who's going to take us.
So you're against the bourgeois middle class momentum, but you'd vote for Theresa May?
Well, the thing is that she's probably more Tony Benn than Corbyn's lot. I mean, yes, I would. There's nothing between them. Only one has power to get us out a little bit, and the other one doesn't have any power at all.
Well, it's a good and controversial call, Dee. I can see the switchboard lighting up. Where do people stand on Dee in Dulwich's defection, if necessary, to vote for Theresa May? Tell me where you stand on this Brexit debate. In a way, we kind of don't or oughtn't still to be debating Brexit, because that matter ought to have been settled 2 years ago. Now, Phil Nielsen says, please do not invite that Breitbart and American right-wing nutcase Stranahan again. You invited him to give an independent view of US affairs and the Kavanaugh hearings, and he just couldn't do it at all. Instead, he lied. Bring back John Le Boutillier. Well, I'm not second to you in my admiration for John Le Boutillier, but many people felt that he was not, as they say, fair and balanced, because his detestation of Donald Trump made his monologues a bit one-paced. The best thing to do is get lots of different American voices on the show, isn't it? He's definitely not a nutcase. He's a very, very highly skilled investigative journalist. Here's Jennifer in Liverpool. Jennifer.
Hello, Mr. Galloway.
Very nice to hear from you. Go ahead.
It's lovely to speak to you.
Thank you.
I was going to ring up and speak to you about the role Len McCluskey and John Landsman played in the fall of the open selection motion.
I'll tell you what then, Jennifer. Let's do that after this break. Now, who would I turn to speak to about the Rocket Man, but the doyenne of entertainment journalists, Caroline Frost. Caroline, welcome back. It's been so long.
Thank you, George.
It's been so long. Now,
I know, too long. We must speak more often.
Yeah, is this the season for musical biopics? We've got billboards everywhere for A Star Is Born. We've got Behind the Candelabra, a biopic about Liberace. I'm not sure how they'll fill a whole show about that. But the Rocket Man, I'll definitely go and see. I saw him, Caroline, before you were born at the Caird Hall in Dundee in the mid-1970s. He was totally sensational. So I'm looking forward to this movie. Are you?
Of course. And as you say, because, I mean, that was, 40 years ago now? And here we are, 2018. Elton John is finally preparing to say goodbye to his live touring, his tireless, bottomless touring. His autobiography is, I think, to hit the shelves maybe next year when he finally puts his pen down. And so this seems a fitting time to reflect on just how that extraordinary, unique career really came to pass.
And is it authorised? You know, they have this phrase, authorised biographies. Is Elton cooperating with it, or is it likely to delve?
He is very much cooperating, as he is with the film. He's the exec producer on the film.
Ah, okay. So I'll not be delving. I'll not be delving into any embarrassing subjects.
Well, do you know but I feel that Elton John is rather rare in that he is quite proud of his somewhat checkered hinterland in a way that many other pop stars have always felt the need to whitewash.
Super injunctions notwithstanding.
Well, and perhaps the present is a little more delicate, but certainly his past, he quite enjoyed that shock factor when he used to appear on Parkinson and all used to ooh and ah. And I think he quite enjoyed being the only gay in the village.
I was so naive. I was so naive, Caroline, that on that tour, when he came on with Kiki D to sing Don't Go Breaking My Heart, I thought she was his partner. I thought they were an item.
Well, I mean, perhaps they were musically.
They were fantastic. That's one of the greatest tracks ever made, I think. Absolutely fantastic. It's life-affirming. Brilliant.
Me.
So the Taron Egerton from the Kingsman movies, he's directing it. Good choice, I think.
No, he's starring, George.
Oh, starring.
Fletcher is directing.
Okay. So Taron is playing Elton?
Yes.
Sorry, I got that wrong. That's even more extraordinary.
What happened was that Tom Hardy was meant to be playing it, and then he, by his own admission, said he couldn't get his chops around the musical notes. He couldn't hit the notes. So he withdrew from the project, and they found someone in the shape of Taron Egerton who can actually sing. So we'll see if he can quite match Elton.
That would be difficult to do, definitely.
Yes.
Well,
yes.
I mean, who else is in it? Do you know?
I think Jamie Bell is in it. It's because
from Billy Elliot.
Yes, and it's from the same writer as Billy Elliot, which is probably why Jamie Bell is on board. As you say, it points to I'm looking forward to the collars and cuffs because of the vibrancy of that era, and certainly the romance between Elton and perhaps Renata. Well, we'll see. We'll see what it sheds light on.
I wonder if will she have a cameo, because it was quite a brief marriage.
It was, but they stayed very, very friendly.
Yes,
Elton's credit.
Yes, absolutely.
So we'll see.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Now, I did mention that musical biopics and musicals are coming out everywhere. I saw today the largest billboard for a movie I have ever seen on the Talgarth Road, for anyone who's driven that way and seen it, for A Star Is Born. Now, I'm not quite old enough to have seen the first make of this, but I did see the remake, and I've lived long enough to see a third edition.
No, George, this is the fourth version of this film.
Oh, my goodness.
So you would have to be quite long in the tooth to cover 3 out of the 4. But yes, I think I can. As a baby, I can just about remember Barbara Streisand and Chris Christopherson. But I think these two, by all reports, match. Bradley Cooper and Lady Gaga match that pair for chemistry, which is no bad thing.
Well, the chemistry between Christopherson and Streisand was very, very good, and she sings like an angel, of course, or did. I don't know if her voice has lasted. I haven't heard her for a long time, but at that time, she was superb.
Yeah.
Can the same be said of Lady Gaga? Is she Barbara Streisand too?
She's possibly up there to qualify. I mean, nobody is La Streisand, but if there are to be perhaps a top 3 qualifying for that role, I would put Lady Gaga in the mix. And what's so interesting is that she, of course, is acting in this film, and Bradley Cooper, who is an actor, Oscar nominated, he's singing.
Yeah, how does that work out?
Their skill set.
How does that work out? I mean, she's a singer of some repute, but is she an actor?
She can. She's been Golden Globe nominated for American Crime Story. So she's got form. And this role, if ever there was a role that lent itself to a songstress, this role is it. Because she basically has to be her most vulnerable self. She wore no scrap of makeup for the role. Bradley Cooper, who also directs and wrote the script, he scraped off all her makeup. He wanted her bare and vulnerable. And I think that's pretty brave. That puts her on the Oscar shortlist for starters.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure about that. And Bradley, how's he as a singer?
Very, very good. Surprisingly good. He didn't want to just sing it well enough. He wanted to sing on a par with a musician, and it's paid off. 6 months of training. I think this film will storm the box office, and I expect it to do well. come awards season. Apparently, interestingly, it was failing with preview audiences. The edit was off. Everyone was very worried. They re-edited it, and now it seems to be a sure thing. All power to the editors. Amazing what they can do with a few changes.
Now, finally, Liberace.
What is it? Is there a new musical? Because
there's a
George,
biopic. There's a biopic called Behind the Candelabra. My producer has told me.
That's ancient.
Is
Are you
it?
talking about
Well,
the
you
one
say
with
that.
Michael
You say
Douglas
that,
and
but
Roy Lowe?
I tweeted on Wednesday night about the thrilling Scottish Cup tie between Aberdeen and Hibs and how it was 0-0 until somebody pointed out that actually that match was played 2 nights earlier and they could tell me the score if they liked. So I've just done it again. I've just done it again, except this time I'm not responsible
Let's
for
quickly
it.
talk instead about the Queen biopic.
Oh, yes.
Let's keep the theme.
So
we've got Bohemian Rhapsody.
I'm always
now,
ready
this
to talk about the Queen, yeah.
is a little bit more of a potentially a whitewash. We'll see, because Brian May feels quite rightly very protective of Freddie Mercury's legacy,
Yes.
which means that when somebody like Sacha Baron Cohen wanted to come along and do a little bit more with the role, Brian wasn't having any of it. Now we've got Rami Malek. He was Golden Globe winning for Mr. Robot. He's in the role. So I'm going to the premiere at Wembley. We'll see what happens.
That will be interesting. Now, on the subject of Sacha Baron Cohen, did you see his television show about America?
I did. What did you think?
I thought it was devastating. I don't want to be prejudiced against our colonial cousins, but that so many of them can be so comprehensively duped by him in quite an unconvincing series of disguises, was remarkable. Even Bernard Sanders sat down for an interview with a wheelchair-ridden Sacha Baron Cohen, pretending to be a madman, and Bernard Sanders sat there for fully 5 minutes, clearly without realising that he'd been set up.
Bonkers. It's bonkers. I mean, in a way, all Sacha Baron Cohen did was shed a light on what we already suspect to be true.
I mean, he did hoodwink a lot of Brits on Azali G, of course, but at least those he hoodwinked then had the excuse that it was first time out. And decades ago. It's going to get harder and harder for him, I think. But he spent a year basically deep cover, and those were the fruits that we saw. Well, we saw congressmen in America speaking to camera in favour of 4-year-old children receiving weapon training and being given guns to take with them into preschool. Elected
it's amazing
members.
What people will do when they think they have someone agreeing with them in front of them, isn't it?
Of course, these vignettes were heavily edited to make the subjects look foolish, and some of them are complaining about it. I think one's even suing about it. But he has squeezed a lot of toothpaste out of this particular tube, hasn't he? He's made it go a long way. Ali G must be 20 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, what's happening is every comedian worth their salt is becoming more and more politicised. And, of course, the fruits are there for them to pluck, which means that somebody as provocative as Sacha Baron Cohen, it's a no-brainer to go in. We know that he despises these people. It's been clear from his satire in years gone past. And it's just really required him to have that audacity to take it to that next step.
Audacity is his middle name. 0344 499 1000. That's the number to call. You call us, we'll call you back. Particularly, as I say, if you disagree with me on Brexit, on the Kavanaugh affair, on the comments made by our guests from Canada, from the United States, and even you may have a contrary point of view on A Star Is Born. And if you do, I want to hear from you. Now, Natasha Ednan Laperouse, 15, went into cardiac arrest on a flight after buying a sandwich at Heathrow Airport in 2016. She was reassured by the lack of specific allergen information on the packaging, the coroner found. Coroner Dr. Sean Cummings said he'd be reporting to the government over whether large businesses should be able to benefit from regulations that allow reduced food labelling for products made in shops. In other words, if you were to buy a sandwich from Sainsbury or Boots or wherever, which had been bought in by the store, there would be lots, indeed comprehensive, food labelling on that product. But if you're making up the sandwiches there and then in-house, it seems that there are fewer regulations that affect you. Natasha ate an artichoke, olive and tapenade baguette bought from a pret-a-manger shop in Terminal 5. She began to feel ill during the flight and suffered a cardiac arrest. Her father, who's a doctor, gave her 2 doses of the adrenaline injection pen, but she continued to deteriorate. The inquest heard the baguette contained sesame, which Natasha was allergic to, but the ingredient was not listed on the packaging. To make matters worse, she would have had access to the defibrillator on the plane, except the plane was coming into land and no one was allowed to get out of their seats. Everyone's hearts, I think, have been touched by this story, but particularly if you're a parent, the idea of being the father of your child as she died next to you, saying, "Daddy, please help me," and her daddy was not able to, and she died. Monica Price is a nutritionist of note and a food safety expert without peer. And she's kindly agreed to join us to discuss this distressing story this evening. Monica, thanks for coming on the show.
No problem, George. Lovely to talk to you tonight. And as you say, what an absolute tragic story that we're talking about.
It's totally heartbreaking, actually.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I heard, I don't know if this is true, but the last call, the telephone was passed when she was in the hospital bed. Her father, I believe, passed the telephone so that she could actually speak to her mother and her brother to say goodbye, because they knew that she was going to die. So I can't even begin to imagine what the family must be feeling at this stage, because although it happened in 2016, the painful memories of that day, I think, will probably live with them for the rest of their lives. And all because she ate something that she was allergic to that clearly didn't have labelling that it should have had, and the coroner quite rightly had found that the labelling that was on the food in Pret-a-Manger was inadequate, and that is just simply, unacceptable in my opinion.
Definitely morally. Legally, probably not. If I have summarised the legal position correctly,
yes,
they weren't required to do so because they were making the sandwiches.
Yes, well, that's it. Well, I mean, EU regulations state that food companies are required by law to warn customers about any allergy risks. So they either have to do that by some signage or packaging or orally, so telling the customers if they're unsure. And as you quite rightly said, George, by not saying any of those or showing any signage, then a customer, of course, is going to assume that all is okay with that food and, take that food and be assured that everything's okay. But currently around 10 people in the UK die each year from an allergic reaction to food, which is that's too many in my opinion. And we have, allergen laws. Now, the allergen laws in the UK, there was a new law actually that came in December 2014 and stated that all food businesses, so whatever they produce, whatever the size, so from a large restaurant to the burger van that you see on the street, must give clear and accurate information about the allergens. So that means that any product that they sold, then we had to know as a customer what was in it. Now, reality, George, is it doesn't happen. I go into local sandwich bars and there's no labelling there. There's no signage. It's up to me to ask, does it have sesame or does this contain peanuts? And that, I think,
the answer might not even be accurate. I mean,
yes,
maybe the
absolutely.
person selling you the sandwich didn't hear you right, or didn't know.
That's right. I mean, as a nutritionist, we have nutritional labels on our food now that show us quite clearly, and again, by law, they have to show us quite clearly the calories, so the energy, which is measured in kcal, and then it shows us the fat, the carbohydrates, the sugars, the protein, and the salt. What's happening is that as a nutritionist, I'm seeing a staggering increase in allergens and food intolerance, and let's sort of get that missed. I think there's a confusion there, George, as to what they are. A food allergy is life-threatening or can be life-threatening. This is all to do with your immune system, so it's a reaction from your immune system. So what it does when you eat something, it mistakes the proteins in that food as a threat to your body. So it immediately release chemicals into your body, which will trigger, a rash, can trigger itching, you'll get sort of hives, wheezing, and then of course more seriously, it closes up the airways and causes anaphylaxis, which is what happened in poor Natasha's case. Whereas a food intolerance, that's nothing to do with the immune system. It doesn't involve the immune system at all. It involves the digestive system. So what happens there is that you can have difficulty digesting certain foods, and this can then cause bloating, stomach pains, all sorts of, diarrhea, any sort of symptoms like that. So there's a big difference, and I think people often get confused and think, oh, well, it's just a food intolerance or it's just a food allergy, when really food allergy must and should be taken quite seriously. As a food industry, we have what's called a HACCP system, which is a food management safety system, and it stands for Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point. Now, as a smaller business, the Food Standards Agency here in the UK said, look, we can't, a HACCP system is what we call from farm to fork. So it's a huge system, rather like a flow chart, where the chicken comes from, what have you done with it, how was it killed, how was it treated, how was it processed, until it reaches us on the plate. So for smaller businesses, that was a too intricate system to use. So our Food Standards Agency come up with something called Safer Food, Better Business, which has been around for years, but I still see people, and I still go to particularly independent restaurants that haven't got a clue about this Safer Food, Better Business. And what that is, it is a food safety management system, and part of that system in there looks at allergens and says, you have to label your food, you have to let customers know. But bottom line is, George, no one's actually monitoring this. The Food Standards Agencies are stretched. This takes investment, and of course, it always, as always, things like this come down to money, and there isn't, there isn't enough money for food safety officers to go around and check every single restaurant in the UK, and that is where we're failing. But someone like Pret, come on.
Well, I was going to say that. A small business might have some kind of excuse, but there can be many bigger businesses in the sector than Pret a Manger.
Absolutely. Pret a Manger's turnover is huge and their profits were increasing. This will have a huge detriment to their reputation, because it doesn't matter what the outcome is, to be honest, because from the family's point of view, no money in the land is going to bring back their daughter. But what they will want to see, and I'm sure is what's going to happen, is they will want to see change. We have to get this right. We have to start looking at what food is doing to us as our customers. Every one of us has to eat food. So anybody out there, anybody that's listening will have a food allergy or a food intolerance, will understand just how difficult it is, because most foods contain sesame seeds. Is a huge problem, because lots of food production, they're often put on the back of the packaging now, may contain, sesame seeds or nuts. Even a packet of peanuts, George, has on the back of the label, may contain traces of nuts. So you look at that and you think, oh, this is ridiculous, because this is a packet of peanuts. So what's happening is people are turning off to it, and that's wrong, because food producers have to do it. But as you quite rightly say, the smaller businesses, and not so small, medium businesses, don't seem to have these the regulatory bodies as the big manufacturers do, the food productions do. So what we have to do here, if I had a restaurant and I was listening to this story and looking at what's been going on and how it's been unfolding, and the very fact it's caused somebody to die, I would be looking at making sure that I'm following the Safer Food, Better Business, making sure, which is a folder, which is you can download it online. It's a very, very, very easy to use food safety management system. And then what you can do is look at your menus. Look at your menus and say, right, how am I actually preparing this? If I'm preparing this from scratch, what do I actually use in this, this dish? And then I would look at making sure that I can inform my customers, making sure that, even if people think, oh, I'll just put up, a little sign. Do you know that sign, something like that can save somebody's life. So even if you're unsure, if you're not getting it right, then for goodness sake, just, you need to be asking the questions, having by the till a sign that says, do you have any allergies? Please ask the staff. It's no good putting a small little sticker on a fridge. You need to put something that's very visual and people can see it. And you need to inform your customers on the menus. This is what's going to be in our products. Put these online on your websites that people can, when they book, a lot of people book restaurants online now. So have this information online on your website. This is not difficult. And of course, in the kitchen area, you've got to avoid cross-contamination. So making sure that you're not using knives, boards, which can have a massive effect on somebody that's got a food allergy. So let
me ask you a deeper question, Monica,
yes.
more as a nutritionist.
Yes.
Where did all this come from? When I was young, and I'm done certain age, I never heard of such things. Maybe they were happening, and we just didn't know why people were dying and becoming very ill. What is it about modern life, if I'm right, that has produced generations now with such sensitivity to different foodstuffs?
Yeah. Do you know, George, that's a very good question. And like you, I was brought up with peanut butter. I think I had peanut butter from as soon as my mum could give it to me. We had peanuts as part of our diet. There's a huge sense of opinion that the food industry, we're introducing so many chemicals and preservatives, flavourings, spices that, not natural spices, food additives that are being added to our food. And of course, we're eating as a nation, we're consuming far, far more ready-made meals now than we ever did before. I mean, I never had a ready meal. I was very lucky when I was younger. It wasn't my mum cooked, and we just had food that came, from the garden, or my mum bought from the grocery and the store, and then my mum prepared the food. So we knew exactly what was going in our food. Nowadays, some people don't cook. They shop purely by ready meals. They shop purely by online. Some people don't even set foot in a supermarket anymore. So personally, as a nutritionist, I believe it's because we've added so many things to our food, and we're not having an understanding about where our foods come from. The food chain has changed enormously. So more pesticides and herbicides, for instance, are being added to our food during the production. And children, for instance, because let's face it, it's the children we're targeting. When anybody that's been pregnant, any of your listeners that have been pregnant will tell you, I have 2 children, George, and when I was pregnant with my son, who's older, it was like, make sure you have plenty of peanuts and eat eggs and eat tuna. Now, when I had my daughter, it was don't eat tuna, don't touch peanuts, and don't have any eggs. So the problem is, I think we're being saturated by so much confusion that I think people are just thinking, I must be allergic, or if they have any kind of reaction to it, then I must be allergic. And in fact, they may just have a food intolerance where it's upsetting their gut, causing bloating and sickness and perhaps diarrhea. But children are more likely to outgrow an allergy to something like milk, eggs and soya. But peanuts and tree nuts or fish or shellfish, unfortunately, they're not so likely to outgrow. And we don't really understand the reasons why. It's purely every one of us is individual, so every one of us will have a reaction to different foods. I mean, sometimes it can be fruit. I mean, I've seen children that can have an allergic reaction to strawberries. It's mostly fruits with any kind of hair, so peaches, strawberries, raspberries, kiwis. You know, kiwis are these are high allergen fruits. And again, thankfully, it won't trigger life-threatening situations where, you know, an EpiPen is needed, but it will just cause, you know, perhaps a tingling sensation in their lips or their tongue, or just a rash around their mouths. So parents will quite rightly think, well, I'm not going to give my child that ever again. But unfortunately, I truly believe personally that by cutting these things out of your diet, your immune system can't get used to them. Now, we can't, you know, if I've had two children, and I've got loads of friends who've had children themselves, and like me, we were told not to eat certain foods. Tuna and peanuts were the big two in it. Well, eggs, actually, the three. And then suddenly we're allowed to do it. Now, if you go to any Mediterranean country, the children that are eating peanuts probably and any kind of nuts from as soon as they can have them ground in any of their foods. So is it because we're taking too many foods out of our children's diet? Let's, you know, because again, focusing on children, I work quite a lot with the early years sector, and in the 0 to 5, for instance, that's considered to be early years, and in the nurseries there, you know, they're absolutely, they cannot have any peanuts, they cannot have any, you know, undercooked eggs, you know, but peanuts is a huge problem. They have a huge problem now with milk, dairy intolerance, so it's lactose intolerance, which is the sugars in the milk. Now, again, like you said, George, there wasn't any of that when I was a child.
No, not at all, no.
What is it we're doing? So the only thing I can think it can be is the fact it's the food itself. It's the production of the food itself. I mean, there's cows that don't even see a green field. You know, we have this image when we drink our milk that, you know, they're in lovely fields and they're being milked properly, you know, by hand. And unfortunately, this is not the case. Our milk production here in the UK now is a massive $1 million production. And what happens is these cows never see the light of day. You know, they're just on like a roundabout. I've seen them, and they're just constantly being milked. Now, you know, who's to say what's right or wrong? But the results of our, if you like, our thirst and our hunger for constant food all the time is going to, from a food manufacturing point of view, they're going to want to give us whatever us as consumers want. And if that means putting chemicals in our food, preservatives in our food to last longer, to make it last longer, then that's what they're going to do. And I think that there could be some of the problems I'm seeing, because I'm seeing a huge increase in children who have food allergies to, for instance, any artificial colourings, artificial sweeteners. And again, there's something in the word, isn't there, George?
Artificial, yeah.
You know, it doesn't. It's not rocket science.
No.
So I think
here's a tweet from Mary. I'd like your view on it, Monica. It says, I believe it's down to GMOs, pesticides, and God knows what they're putting into the animals too. Almost every one of my nieces have allergies or are celiac and lactose intolerant.
Yes.
Almost
I mean, again,
every one of her nieces.
That's just a dreadful thing, isn't it?
Something is going on. I'm not sure.
Well, I think so. I mean, I do, as I say, personally, I do believe it's the additives that we're adding to our food. If you strip, I work with clients who have cancer, George, as well as, you know, other immune system disorders and diseases. And the moment they come to me, usually they come to a nutritionist, usually because they're just trying to find something, you know, they're trying to, so I'm throwing them a lifeline, really. And so we strip their diet of anything artificial and go totally organic. And I'm telling you now, that can have a massive improvement on that person's health and well-being. or I'm not saying for one moment that can cure cancer, but what I am saying to you is it can elongate the life, and I know that for a fact because I've done it. I've worked with people, and you touched on celiac there. I mean, celiac disease is actually neither a food allergy or a food intolerance. It's actually an autoimmune disease. So what happens is when you eat gluten, it damages the lining of your small intestine, and again, it's a horrendous disease. You know, most foods that we have on our shelves contain gluten of some kind. So anybody that has the celiac disease, you know, has had such a tough time. But again, supermarkets now have got gluten-free ranges, so you can actually walk down an aisle.
Yeah, big time.
And you've got and again they're looking at this. This is a marketing opportunity there. You know, people. There is a shift. There's a definite shift, and I do believe everything kind of goes around in circles. We are shifting away from artificial sweeteners. Coca-Cola, the biggest drinks company in the world, you know, have bought. Was it Costa Coffee? I'm pretty certain it was Costa Coffee. They bought, I think it was one of the big main chains of coffee. Now, they've done that for a reason, because their drinks, their diet drinks and their sugary drinks are actually on a decline in sales. So they're looking for other avenues, and where they realise, for instance, that coffee's become, you know, really popular here in the UK. So for the first time ever, they had their profits slumped over their drinks, particularly diet drinks, because people are starting to ask questions about the artificial sweeteners and flavours in them.
Again, the clue's in the word artificial.
Absolutely,
Monica, unfortunately,
absolutely.
we're out of time. It's been utterly fascinating talking to you. And from that tragedy of poor Natasha's death, we have actually at least been forced now to focus on some of these issues. That was Monica Price, nutritionist and food safety expert. Now, quite a lot of listeners have been texting, calling and wondering why I'm not dealing with issues that I would normally be dealing with in a week like this. Normally I deal with issues that are big in the news, and also issues that other people might not deal with, or at least not from my perspective. You'll just have to bear with us for this period. There are obvious difficulties. You know my point of view on those issues that you'd like me to talk about. You can follow me on Twitter, you can follow me on Facebook, you can watch me on television, you can subscribe to my Patreon page. Lots of places, lots of platforms where I am opining all the time about the issues you're disappointed that I've not been able to cover tonight. So please forgive me and bear with me, bear with us on that. Murray McFarlane, my old friend, says the corn syrup derivatives in children's yogurts, fructose, affect their lives worse than an alcoholic's. Dr. Lustig treats obese toddlers and babies and chronic diabetics. See YouTube, Sugar, the Bitter Truth. I've seen the program, Sugar, the Bitter Truth. It is totally devastating. I gave up taking sugar, by and large, a long time ago, and the better for it. But sugar is a really, really, really powerful weapon. Let's take Lizzie, the lovely Lizzie Fletcher in Gloucester. Always a pleasure, Lizzie.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, I thought I'd lost you then.
No, not at all. You'll never lose me. God willing.
I wanted to talk to you about a couple of things. I've just returned from the Labour conference.
Oh, did you enjoy it?
Yes. It was very strange, the people that have been on your show this evening. First of all, the lady who wanted to talk about Brexit.
Yes. That was quite extraordinary.
It was. I immediately thought, oh, keep taking the propaganda pills, dear.
Yeah, but it's worth bearing in mind, Lizzie, if that's the point of view of an educated woman in Dulwich, a highly articulate one, that Brexit is sufficiently important to her, that Labour backsliding and confusion on it has lost her vote. Let me tell you, there will be lots more like her elsewhere in the country, not in Dulwich.
I think it speaks to the mainstream media concentration on this subject, actually, George. I mean, who says Brexit is the biggest question today?
Well, for a lot of people it is.
Well, who, though? Apart from the lady who spoke on your show earlier, who says that Brexit is the biggest question? I mean, Nick Robinson...
The vote in itself, Lizzie, it was the biggest turnout ever in any British poll, and 17.4 millions who voted for Brexit is the largest number of people in Britain who have ever voted for anything ever.
But when you go to the shop, who's talking about Brexit? When you go to the pub, who's talking about Brexit? When you go anywhere, who's talking about Brexit?
Well, it depends what shop, pub and store you're going to.
That's true, that's true.
I mean, Dee in Dulwich was talking about it. And the rise in the UKIP vote in the polls speaks to it. And the...
Well, it definitely speaks to mainstream propaganda.
Well,
I'm
you
not
can't just
sure
put it
about...
down... No, you can't just put it down to propaganda, because people want Brexit, millions of them. And if they feel it's being stolen from them, they're going to be angry about it. And if Labour allows itself to be so positioned that it is held responsible for not getting Brexit, Labour will pay a high price at the polls, I can assure you.
But I don't think that Jeremy Corbyn's recent visit to Barnier, was it? I don't think that speaks to Jeremy giving up on the idea of Brexit.
No, it doesn't. But as you were listening, you'll know. As you were listening, you'll know. Corbyn and McDonnell had one position on Brexit. Starmer had a second position on Brexit.
Yes.
And the Shadow Foreign Secretary has a third position on Brexit. If that's not confusion, Lizzie, I mean, it's not propaganda. It was confusion. People saw it live on TV.
It's not confusion. It's the right wing of the Labour Party. People want their voice represented. So, and it speaks to another part of the Labour conference, the open selection vote.
Oh, yes.
The right wing of people, the people who are right wing in the Labour Party or centrist, or right centrist, want their MPs to retain their jobs. They want their voice represented, and you think, well, that's fair enough. Everybody should have their voice represented. But they know if open selection was employed, their MPs would almost certainly be ousted by left-wing members that are active and becoming rather influential in constituency Labour parties.
Well, that was a second reason for disappointment at the conference, wasn't it? The fact that open selection was defeated, together with the Brexit breakfast.
Not for right-wing members, it wasn't.
No, but...
It wasn't a disappointment for them.
For you it was.
Well, for me it was. But, you know, I do think that, first of all, the CLPs made so many motions, sent so many motions, that a clear motion couldn't be made out of that. And it allowed the right wing, which is still prevalent in the Labour Party, still very influential, although diminishing, it allowed them to keep their MPs in their jobs, which is their sole purpose.
Well, you know my view on this. If the Parliamentary Labour Party remains the same, then the last 3 years will be nothing as to the next 3 years.
Absolutely. And if it had gone through, really, it would have brought the MPs to trial. You know, it would have made sure that they had to enact their constituencies' wishes.
Yeah, I mean, the key point for me, Liz, is that the open selection made the whole thing automatic. In other words, there was no black mark against an MP because they had to be reselected, because every MP had to be reselected in every parliamentary term.
Don't forget, it brings about the bias of right-wing MPs would be ousted by left-wing members of constituency Labour parties.
Well, maybe so, but the point is, every attempt to get a new MP now will be a battle royal, as opposed to everybody going through it every time. Lizzie, running out of time, must squeeze in Derek in Edinburgh. Derek.
George, how you doing?
I'm good, sir. I'm good. Go ahead.
I'll tell you what, George. It's basically about the Labour Party. I've been a Labour voter all my life. I'm 56 years of age, a lorry driver, a guy who voted for Brexit. You just sees now it just all getting stolen away from us. It's just, you know, the way the Labour Party is behaving. I mean, I didn't even look on Corbyn as a Labour Party man. I mean, what happened to all the great Labour men, the John Smiths and the Donald Dewars that were proper Labour men like yourself? But now, well, Corbyn wouldn't even raise the subject of Brexit, you know, or a second referendum. It's just, I never voted for Corbyn. I voted Labour all my life. I never voted for Corbyn at the last election. I voted for Tory. And my dad knew that. He'd turn in his grave. But that'll be my position moving forward if that Corbyn is still the leader of this party. I think he's totally and utterly destroyed the Labour Party, or what I look on and remember as the Labour Party.
Well, John Smith, God rest his soul, was a very close friend of mine. But I've got to remind you that in 1973, John Smith was one of the Labour MPs who betrayed the Labour whip and took Britain into the European Union in the first place. So, frankly, if he'd still been around, he'd have been prominent in pushing for a reversal of the Brexit vote. And ditto Donald Dewar, in my opinion. But I'm touched that you included me in your pantheon of real Labour men. I think that your message has to be heard. Dee in Dulwich, Derek in Edinburgh, both Labour, both going to vote Conservative because of what they perceive to be backsliding by Labour on the subject. You might think that's propaganda, but they were both real people, real callers, and you better listen to them. It's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you. And if it was, come back next week at the same time and bring another listener, won't you? And don't forget to consult all my other platforms to hear my point of view.